Welcome back to the Political Brief. Today, we're looking at a congressional hearing that raises some serious questions about free speech, political intimidation, and whether America's universities are protecting debate or shutting it down. One witness described being surrounded by hundreds of protesters, forced to barricade herself inside a room, and repeatedly hearing the words, "We fight back." But what happened next is what really caught my attention. Because this hearing isn't simply about one disagreement over transgender issues. It's about what happens when political activism crosses the line into intimidation, and whether the same standards are being applied to everyone. So stay with me, because there are some important details in this testimony that deserve a closer look.
And I want to say to our witnesses, thank you for being here, for standing up and showing us your courage. I'd like to focus a couple of questions and ask Ms. Gaines to respond. You know, the evening that the attack on you happened, I think the whole country thought, how is this possible? You've had the courage to speak out on an issue that is very personal to you. I have 3 daughters, and to think about the issue that you're talking about and standing up for what you believe in, the freedom of speech, the First Amendment protects your ability to do that. And yet, San Francisco State University President Lynn Mahoney wrote a letter sympathizing those who attacked you. And I can't imagine how that has made you feel. I know how it's made me feel.
No, it's we've used the term domestic terrorists a lot in this hearing, and that's constantly something I get called by these same left-leaning protesters who, again, for simply saying women deserve fairness, we deserve safety, and we deserve privacy, and we deserve respect. And I get called a domestic terrorist all the time. So this term for me, maybe I have a skewed perception of what it means. But yes, it's been, I don't know, again, it's just disheartening to be in the position I'm in, feeling like I'm asking for the bare minimum, feeling like I'm asking for something that is so simple that we all are entitled to, yet I'm being, held hostage. And there's one more piece I wanted to mention about this night that I haven't really touched on. I briefly touched on it in my testimony, but the verbiage outside the room, when I was still giving my speech, these protesters, the video doesn't do a good job showing of just how many were in these stairways. I mean, it was hundreds of people. But these people, they were outside the rooms, and one side of the hallway would yell, "Trans rights are under attack," and the other side would yell back, "What do? We fight back." And they kept using the term, "we fight back." And so after I'd finally been barricaded and I was in this room for a couple hours and they kept saying it, I'm like, why do they keep saying "we fight back"? And we've talked a lot about this stemming from the top in regards to Trump and January 6th and Tucker Carlson giving the license to people to basically do whatever they want but we're not talking about this on this side of it, because the day before this incident at San Francisco State, the Biden administration press secretary had a press release, a press conference where she says word for word, our trans community is resilient and they fight back. And I find it so ironic they were using the exact same verbiage, "we fight back." They kept saying it continuously. And so I wanted to put that on the record because we've talked about it a lot stemming from the top on the other side, but I think it's crucial to understand that goes both ways.
Well, Ms. Gaines, thank you for your courage. Thank you for standing up for what you believe in. Any sort of threats or violence or intimidation is despicable. It has no place in our society. And to my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, real courage lies in being able to stand up even when it's not popular, and even when you may not agree with it, but being able to stand up to a bully, and that's what this is. This is about a bully in our society for a narrative that some don't agree with, and it doesn't matter which side you stand on, but you have stood up to that bully, and I applaud you for doing that. And the country is watching you and your leadership, and we appreciate what you're doing. Mr. Chairman, thank you for holding this hearing and standing up to a bully. We should all condemn any violence that happens, and I think that that's exactly what this hearing is about, and I yield back.
Well done, Mr. Pfluger. The gentleman yields back.
There's a bigger story unfolding in this hearing than just another political argument over transgender rights. A witness describes being surrounded, threatened, and forced to barricade herself inside a room while protesters repeatedly shouted, "We fight back." But what makes this testimony especially striking is what she says happened before and after that night, and the question of whether political rhetoric can create an atmosphere where intimidation becomes acceptable. Today on the Political Brief, we're breaking down her testimony, the university's response, and why this hearing raises some serious questions about free speech, political violence, and whether the rules apply equally to everyone. What we're hearing here is a pretty remarkable account. Ms. Gaines is describing something that should concern every American, regardless of where you stand on the transgender debate. You can disagree with somebody. You can think their position is outdated, offensive, or completely wrong. You can protest them. You can challenge them. You can organize against them. But once political disagreement turns into intimidation, threats, harassment, or violence, we have crossed a very different line. And that's the part one think deserves the most attention. Because listen to what she's saying about that night. She wasn't describing a quiet disagreement between a handful of students. She says there were hundreds of protesters throughout the stairways and hallways, with people outside the room while she was still speaking. And according to her testimony, people on one side were yelling, "Trans rights are under attack," while others responded, "What do we do?" Followed by, "We fight back." Now, obviously, words matter, but words also have context. Fight back can mean peaceful protest. It can mean organizing politically. It can mean voting. It can mean speaking louder and making your case more forcefully. There is nothing inherently violent about the phrase. But if someone is trapped inside a room because a large crowd has surrounded the area, then those words take on a much more serious meaning for the person actually experiencing the situation. That's why I think the testimony deserves to be taken seriously, even if you completely disagree with Ms. Gaines on the underlying political issue. And this is where I think conservatives have to be consistent. If someone on the right threatens a protester, that's wrong. If someone on the left threatens a speaker, that's wrong. If a conservative mob tries to intimidate somebody into silence, condemn it. If a progressive mob tries to intimidate somebody into silence, condemn that too. That should not be controversial. Unfortunately, in modern politics, it often is. We have created a political environment where too many people judge an act based on who committed it and who the target was. If their side does it, they find an explanation. If the other side does it, suddenly it's the end of democracy. That's not principle. That's tribalism. And America desperately needs less of it. The First Amendment isn't there to protect opinions that everybody already likes. That's easy. If you stand up and say something that 95% of the room agrees with, you're probably not taking much of a risk. The real test of free speech comes when somebody says something that makes the room uncomfortable. That's when we find out whether we actually believe in freedom of speech or whether we only believe in freedom of speech for people who agree with us. Ms. Gaines makes that point very clearly when she describes feeling like she's asking for the bare minimum: fairness, safety, privacy, and respect. You don't have to agree with every part of her argument to understand that those are legitimate things to ask for. And here's where I think the right has an important argument to make. There has been an enormous amount of pressure in recent years to treat certain political and cultural questions as completely settled. You're told that there is only one acceptable position. You're told that questioning certain policies makes you hateful. You're told that raising concerns about women's sports, women's privacy, biological sex, or single-sex spaces automatically makes you some kind of extremist. But that's not how a free country is supposed to work. You should be able to ask difficult questions. You should be able to challenge popular ideas. You should be able to say, "I don't agree." And you shouldn't have to worry that expressing an unpopular opinion is going to result in a mob showing up at your door or surrounding the place where you're speaking. That's the principle, and it should apply to everyone. Now, one of the most interesting parts of this testimony is when Ms. Gaines talks about being called a domestic terrorist. That accusation is not trivial. Words like that carry enormous weight. In today's political environment, labeling somebody a terrorist, fascist, Nazi, extremist, bigot, or traitor has become far too common. These words are increasingly used not to describe genuine threats, but to stigmatize political opponents. And when you constantly tell people that someone on the other side is dangerous, evil, or a threat to society, you should not be surprised when political disagreement becomes more hostile. Again, I'm not saying that a particular phrase automatically causes violence. I'm saying we should be careful about the political culture we create. If your political strategy is constantly telling people that your opponents are monsters, threats, extremists, or enemies of humanity, eventually you're going to make normal political disagreement almost impossible. And that's a problem on both sides. But here's where I think the hearing gets even more important. Ms. Gaines says that the day before the incident, a university administration spokesperson described the transgender community as resilient and said they fight back. Then, according to Gaines, she heard protesters repeatedly using that same language during the confrontation. Now, let's be fair here. A phrase like fight back by itself does not prove that somebody ordered protesters to attack anyone. It doesn't, and we shouldn't pretend it does. But the question raised by her testimony is still legitimate. What responsibility do institutions and political leaders have for the atmosphere they create? Because leadership matters. The language coming from the top matters. The way institutions respond to political disagreement matters. And most importantly, whether those institutions enforce the same standards regardless of who is involved matters. If a conservative speaker is threatened, the university should protect that speaker. If a progressive speaker is threatened, the university should protect that speaker. If a transgender student is harassed, that should be condemned. If a woman expressing concerns about women's privacy or women's sports is harassed, that should also be condemned. You don't get to pick and choose based on ideology. That's what equal protection actually means in practice. And I think that's what the congressman was getting at when he told Ms. Gaines that real courage means standing up even when it's unpopular. That's an important point. Courage isn't required when everyone is cheering for you. Courage is required when everyone around you is telling you to shut up. And whether you agree with Ms. Gaines or not, she clearly believes she's standing up for something she considers important, that deserves at least a basic level of respect in a free society. You know, one thing that really bothers me about modern politics is how quickly disagreement gets turned into moral condemnation. You can disagree with somebody without believing they are evil. You can believe someone is mistaken without believing they deserve to be silenced. You can believe a policy is harmful without believing everyone who supports it is a monster. And you can defend a person's right to speak without endorsing what that person says. That last part is especially important. Defending free speech is not the same thing as agreeing with the speech. That's a distinction Americans seem to be losing. If a person says something you hate, the answer isn't automatically to shut them down. The answer is to argue. Make your case. Bring evidence. Convince people. Vote. Debate. That's politics. Intimidation isn't politics. Violence isn't politics. Threats aren't political persuasion. And if you're confident that your position is correct, you shouldn't need a mob to enforce it. This is why I think the university's role deserves scrutiny in situations like this. Universities are supposed to be places where difficult ideas can be discussed. They are supposed to encourage debate and expose students to arguments they may not like. A university shouldn't become a place where certain political viewpoints are protected while others are treated as unacceptable. And I'm not saying universities should tolerate genuine threats or criminal conduct. Absolutely not. Protect students. Protect faculty. Protect speakers. Protect everybody. But protecting people from violence is not the same thing as protecting them from hearing an opinion they dislike. That's where the distinction has to be made. Because if the standard becomes, you made me uncomfortable, therefore you shouldn't be allowed to speak, then free speech becomes meaningless. And frankly, conservatives have seen this problem repeatedly. There are plenty of people who are perfectly happy to talk about tolerance until someone says something they don't tolerate. They'll say, "We believe in diversity." But do they believe in diversity of thought? Do they believe in ideological diversity? Do they believe a woman can disagree with the prevailing narrative on gender without being branded a hateful extremist? Do they believe a conservative student should be able to express an unpopular opinion on campus without fearing social or institutional retaliation? Those are the questions we should be asking. Because America doesn't need more ideological conformity. We need more freedom to disagree. And I want to make another point here, because this is where the right needs to be intellectually honest. We cannot complain about political intimidation when it happens to conservatives and then excuse it when it happens to someone we dislike. That's exactly how we lose the moral argument. If somebody on the left gets attacked, we shouldn't be saying, well, look what they said. If somebody on the right gets attacked, we shouldn't be saying, well, they brought it on themselves. No, that's not America. Nobody forfeits their basic right to safety because they hold an unpopular political position. And I think the congressman was right to say that violence and intimidation have no place in our society. That shouldn't be a Republican statement. It shouldn't be a Democratic statement. It should be an American statement. The bigger question is whether we're going to actually live by it. Because it's easy to condemn violence when your side is the victim. The real test comes when the person being threatened is somebody you absolutely cannot stand. That's when principle matters. That's when character matters. And that's when the First Amendment matters. Now, there's another part of this that I think deserves attention. The accusation that political rhetoric from the top somehow gives ordinary people permission to cross the line. This argument has been made repeatedly in American politics, especially when discussing January 6th and other episodes of political violence. And I think there's a legitimate principle underneath that argument. Leaders have responsibilities. Public figures have influence. Political movements have responsibilities. But that principle has to work both ways. If we believe rhetoric matters when it comes from one political movement, then we have to acknowledge that rhetoric matters when it comes from the other. We can't say that inflammatory language is dangerous only when conservatives use it. And we can't say it is harmless only when progressives use it. That double standard is precisely what destroys public trust. So if someone tells their supporters that their political opponents are enemies who must be fought, we should ask what exactly they mean. Does fight mean vote? Does it mean protest peacefully? Does it mean organize? Does it mean debate? Or does it mean something else? Leaders should be clear, because when tensions are already high, ambiguity can be dangerous. And that's why I think this hearing is worth paying attention to beyond the immediate controversy. This isn't just about one university. This isn't just about one group of protesters. This isn't just about one disagreement over transgender policy. It's about what kind of political culture we want to have in America. Do we want a country where people can openly disagree? Or do we want a country where the loudest and most aggressive crowd gets to decide which opinions are acceptable? Because if we choose the second option, eventually everybody loses. Today the mob may be going after somebody you disagree with. Tomorrow it could be you. That's the part people forget. Rights aren't supposed to be rewards for people who have the correct political opinions. They're supposed to protect everybody. That's why the First Amendment matters. And that's why I believe the central issue here should be simple. You don't have to agree with Ms. Gaines to defend her right to speak. You don't have to support every argument made by the protesters to defend their right to peacefully protest. But once threats, violence, or intimidation enter the picture, the standard should be clear. Stop, condemn it, investigate it, and hold whoever is responsible accountable. No excuses, no political favoritism. No, our side is allowed to do it because our cause is righteous. That's how a constitutional republic is supposed to function. And if we're being honest, America could use a lot more of that right now, because the political temperature is already high enough. People are angry. People are frustrated. People are suspicious of institutions. And people increasingly believe that the rules are different depending on which political team you're on. The answer isn't to pour gasoline on that fire. The answer is to restore basic standards. Tell the truth. Debate ideas. Defend your position. Challenge your opponents. But don't threaten them. Don't attack them. Don't try to physically intimidate them into silence. And don't pretend that a person becomes less deserving of basic rights simply because you dislike what they believe. That's the lesson I take from this testimony. And frankly, I think conservatives should be willing to say it loudly. We believe in free speech. We believe in peaceful protest. We believe in law and order. We believe women should be able to raise legitimate questions about fairness, safety, and privacy without automatically being labeled extremists. And we should also believe that people on the other side have the same basic rights. That's not weakness. That's strength. Because the Constitution doesn't need us to agree with each other. It needs us to respect the rules that allow us to disagree without destroying each other. And when you look at what Ms. Gaines described, That's really what this hearing is forcing us to confront. What happens when disagreement stops being a debate and starts becoming intimidation? What happens when institutions appear to take sides? What happens when political language becomes so heated that people on the ground start believing confrontation is justified? Those are uncomfortable questions, but they're exactly the questions we should be asking. And maybe the most important question of all is this. If we really believe in free speech, are we willing to defend it when the person speaking is someone we don't like? Because that's the test. It's easy to defend speech you agree with. It's easy to defend people who vote the way you vote. It's easy to condemn political violence when your side is the victim. But real principles don't change depending on who's standing at the microphone. So whatever you think about the underlying transgender debate, I think there is a lesson here that every American should be able to agree with. You don't defeat an argument by threatening the person making it. You defeat an argument by proving it wrong. You don't protect freedom by silencing unpopular opinions. You protect freedom by allowing people to speak, debate, challenge, and persuade. And you don't strengthen America by turning political opponents into enemies. You strengthen America by remembering that they are still Americans. That's where I stand on this. I believe Ms. Gaines has every right to argue her position, just as those who disagree with her have every right to argue theirs. But nobody should have to fear violence or intimidation simply for speaking their mind. And if we're serious about preserving the First Amendment, that principle has to apply even when it's inconvenient, especially when it's inconvenient. Because the moment freedom of speech becomes conditional on whether the crowd approves of what you're saying, it isn't really freedom anymore. And that's something worth remembering the next time you hear somebody say they support free speech. Because the real question isn't whether they defend speech they like. The real question is whether they'll defend speech they hate. That is the standard. That is the test. And that's exactly why this hearing deserves our attention. If you found this analysis valuable, make sure you subscribe to the Political Brief, because we're going to keep breaking down the biggest political stories, the arguments behind them, and the questions the mainstream conversation sometimes skips over. Let us know in the comments. Should universities be required to protect controversial speakers equally, regardless of political ideology? And where should the line be drawn between peaceful protest and intimidation? I'll see you in the next one.